Well, I'm going to just invite you to, you can use your phone or whatever device you want to use to turn to the Bible, but it's great to use the paper Bible, the bench Bible in front of you. I'll give you the page number that I'm going to be going from today. So page 719. 719. You'll know you're at the right location when you see Daniel in bold. And that's where we're going to be reading from today, is the book of Daniel. While you're turning there, I just want to say membership classes today. I'm going to be assisting the elders in helping to lead that. And I always enjoy getting to know people through the membership class. And it's a place where you can ask any question about our church that you're curious about, and we're happy to answer that. This week I got a question about our church from one of our members, so I thought I'd maybe share it with you. It says, "Hi, Pastor Steve. We are closing in on my 1-year anniversary of becoming a member at church. When is the party?" So, this came from a guy, you probably don't know him, his name's Lee Behrens. So Lee's an educator and a teacher, so one thing I've learned from teachers is there's no such thing as a stupid question, and so it needs a legitimate answer. So this is what I wrote back. I said, "Hi Lee, thanks for reaching out. We started making party plans for your 1-year anniversary the moment you signed up for membership. It was a huge win for us as a church. But then we realized that you'd been attending for 30 years before you became a member. So we abandoned the smaller celebration for a much larger one. Of course, a party of this magnitude takes much longer time to plan because it has to be done right. Our whole team is working with high anticipation for Behrens-Appaloosa 2034. Note, we celebrate your wife's membership and partnership in the gospel every single day. St. Caroline is the best." Well, I just want to say for all of you today, yeah, let's celebrate 1 year with Lee Behrens, yeah. So today when you have your family feast, we'll christen it the Lee Behrens 1-year membership lunch. And I hope you can celebrate that milestone with him. Anyhow, just a little bit of fun. Lee Behrens' love language, in case you're wondering if this is how we treat all our members, Lee Behrens' love language is teasing. And he has loved me way more than I've ever loved him in this regard. And so this is just trying to tilt it back a little bit. All right, page 719 is where we're going to be reading today. We're starting a new series called Shining in Babylon. It's a study of the book of Daniel, all 12 chapters. And I want to explain where the title comes from. It comes from the very last chapter, Daniel 12, verse 3. I'll just read it for you. You don't have to turn there. "Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever." So those who are wise and those who lead many to righteousness will shine. Will shine like the brightness of heaven and like the stars forever and ever. So the book of Daniel is about how to be a faithful witness, or how to shine in a dark and hostile environment. You see, unlike most other books in the Bible, this book is not written from inside of Israel. I'll show you that in the first verses. So let's just turn to page 719 and look at it. "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it." They were under siege. And the Lord, by the way, being under siege is a bit of a theme of the first 7 chapters of Daniel. "And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God." So, I'm going to just start off here with a warning. There's a warning of the seriousness of sin. It's sort of like the book of Daniel sort of starts as another story is sort of ending. And it's the story of Israel, who were called to be God's people, not following Jesus, not following God, and not following Yahweh. In fact, the kings of Israel, which was the northern kingdom, they were all pretty much corrupt and didn't follow God in what they were called to do. And years before this, they had already been carried out. They'd already been conquered by the Assyrians and carried off into captivity. Judah, the southern half of the kingdom of Israel, they had done a little bit better, had some kings who had called the people back to serving God. But there have been quite a few now in a row, and King Jehoiakim was the 19th king after David, and he continued to lead Israel in a downward spiral of disobedience and compromise and unbelief. And so God had warned the people of Judah that if they continued to walk in this path, that he would send them into exile. Like they wouldn't get to stay in the promised land that he had given them. He would take them out. And so in 605 BC, he keeps his promise, and they are brought into exile. So we're only 2 verses into the chapter, and already there's a warning for all of us. And God may be speaking to you right now through his word, and so I hope that you will hear what he has to say. You may think, I can keep continuing in this sin, and there won't be any consequences. There won't be any negative effects. But just seeing this, God keeping his word, his promise, which was a promise that if you continue to disobey, I'm going to hand you over. I'm going to hand you over. And in this case, they were handed over to be conquered and captured by a foreign king. So it's not beyond God to hand us over into some kind of exile, some kind of suffering if we persist in sinful disobedience to him. God disciplines even those that he loves. And our sin rightly brings his judgment upon us. And when we ignore him over and over again, like Israel did, in an area of sin, it's like mocking God and saying, God's not going to do anything about this. Galatians 6:7 tells us that that's not true. It says, do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. So if you feel like, I'm just doing this and there's no consequences and there's no negative results in my life, don't be fooled. God's patience is not the same as apathy. And he will be, in many seasons, I've seen that in my own life, graciousness and patience for a long term, but he's not patient forever. There is a time where he brings discipline and judgment into our life. So today, I just start this with a serious note. If there's something you need to deal with today, don't ignore his call for you to turn from sin and turn back to him. All right, let's keep reading. Verse 3. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. So the best of the best were chosen, and Ashpenaz was to teach them the Chaldean language and the literature of Babylon. They were to be schooled for 3 years in the ways of Babylon. So let's talk for a minute about Babylon. What is Babylon? Well, okay. So Babylon here refers to a specific kingdom in the 6th century BC located in what is modern-day Iraq. But in the Bible, Babylon is also used to represent something else. It's used to represent a spiritual power at work against God and his people in every kingdom in every age. In the New Testament, the early Christians used the word Babylon sort of like a code word for Rome. So they were living under the Roman Empire at that time. The Babylon Empire had disappeared. But in the Roman Empire, they would call Rome Babylon. In other words, indicating that spiritual opposition to God was still at work in Rome as much as it was in the original Babylon. In the book of Revelation, Babylon becomes the Apostle John's name for the whole world system that's in opposition to Jesus. in Daniel 1:2, if you've got your bench Bible, just look at Daniel 1:2. You'll see a little letter B beside the word Babylonian. So it means there's a footnote, and you can go to the bottom of the page, and you'll see a footnote that simply says the Hebrew word Shinar. Some English translations, when they say they went back to Babylonia, it'll say they went back to the land of Shinar. So what's Shinar? Genesis 11 is where we first find about Shinar. Genesis 11:2 says, as the people moved eastward, this is after Noah's flood, as the people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. And then in verse 4, then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. So Babylon, the spiritual Babylon, and the land of Shinar, the actual physical location, was where all mankind gathered together in order to build a great tower to make a name for themselves. Now, God had told them, mankind, to be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. The idea was initially that we were made in His image so that we would bring representation of God to the whole of creation. And we would care for creation and be in charge of it, but we would be His representatives in the world. Well, they're not doing that. They refused to go fill the whole earth. They said, let's all camp here. Let's build this glorious city, and we're going to build a tower up to heaven. And then we will have made a name for ourselves. So, the tower was called what? Anyone remember? Babylon. The point is this, Babylon is a term for the spiritual kingdom at work in the world powers since the Tower of Babel. It's a kingdom built in opposition to God, independent of God, the kingdom where man is in charge and man is at the center. And it's still active today and will be until Jesus comes and brings it to an end. In fact, in Revelation, we see how Satan, also called the dragon in Revelation, will use government, media, business, economy, all sorts of different systems to make war against the people of God. I'll give you 2 verses out of Revelation. Revelation 12:17 tells us who Babylon targets. It says, then the dragon was enraged at the woman. There's lots of symbolism here. The dragon, which is Satan, was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring. Who are her offspring? Those who keep God's commands and hold fast to their testimony about Jesus. So there's an evil force, Satan, who is waging war against the church, right, against the followers of Jesus. And then Revelation 14:18 tells us more about Babylon is pressuring us to do. It says, a second angel followed and said, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. So this is as Jesus is coming again, that Babylon's power will be destroyed. Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, which made all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adulteries. So now, in our story today, we're going to see a moment of decision, a moment of being forced to drink a certain type of wine, and it's very interesting that's in there as well. But there's a pressure that Babylon exerts, and it could be the pressure of being mocked, it could be the pressure of being threatened, it could be pressure under the threat of death, as many Christians have experienced throughout the centuries. But it's a pressure to conform, to drink the maddening wine of her adulteries, as it's called. So, that's a little bit of what Babylon is, but what about us in Babylon? Well, most of us are called to serve in Babylon. Most of us, just like Daniel, are called to serve in Babylon. Now, I'm not saying we're going to Iraq to work there. I'm saying the spiritual atmosphere that is against God. Now, there's some of us who are called to serve in the church, and so maybe not every day are we out in Babylon as much, but it doesn't matter whether you're called to serve in the church or not. You can't really escape the spiritual system that is Babylon that we have in our culture and is in every culture and has been throughout the years. Thankfully for us, God's given us his word, so we have resources, incredible resources, which includes the book of Daniel. And Daniel is a really awesome book. Daniel is like a manual for how to survive, how to thrive, how to shine when you find yourself in Babylon. It's a really interesting book. It's written in an interesting way. Chapters 1 to 7 are all about the events in the life of Daniel and his friends in Babylon. Okay? So there's a lot of famous stories in there. In the weeks to come, we'll hear about hungry lions. We're going to hear about huge imposing idols, fiery furnaces built to turn living people into ashes, disembodied hands that leave threatening messages. People in low positions are given exalted positions, and people in exalted positions are brought to new lows. There's hostile places of work and education that are deadly competitive, and yet God is at work in all of it. Now, chapters 8 to 12 are Daniel's prophecy about the restoration of Israel, the coming of the Messiah, and the end of the world. Chapter 1 is written in the Hebrew language because it actually starts in the land of Israel. But chapters 2 to 7 are written in Aramaic, a language of Babylon, because all those events take place in Babylon. But then when you get to 8 to 12 again, it's written in Hebrew again, because they're the prophecies about the future. And we're talking about global things and the end of time. So imagine starting to read a book and realizing after you did the first chapter that the second chapter is in some language you can't read. This is a very interesting way that the book has been made. So the challenge the book of Daniel presents is this, especially for Daniel and his friends. You may know what it's like to serve God on your home turf, like when you're in Israel. But what if you're taken out of that? What if you're not on your home turf? What if you're in enemy territory? Do you know what it looks like to serve God in Babylon? Or to say it another way, what does faithfulness to God look like in a realm controlled by powers at war with the gospel and at war with God? Well, let's get back into our story. So verse 5 is where we're at. It says, the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. So Daniel is one of 4 young men from Judah who have been chosen. They're good looking, they're smart, they're healthy, they're athletic, they're the best of the best, and they've been conscripted into Nebuchadnezzar's royal service. Now, they themselves are from the nobility, so they might be grandsons or great-grandsons of some king of Israel or of Judah. And it's interesting, some of the later authors, like even Plato, he wrote a little bit about this type of schooling. You know, so it's 3 years, not quite a university degree, but maybe enough time to shift your allegiance from one culture to another. And surely that was the intent. So these boys have come from Judah, but the goal by the time we're done training them is for them to forget their identity with Judah and to identify with Babylon. So Plato wrote about these programs, and he said that the age group that many of these ancient programs was, they'd start in the teenage years, so maybe about 14, and if it's running 3 years, to about 17. So, I mean, maybe a good guesstimate would be that Daniel and his friends are about 15 when this happens. So part of Nebuchadnezzar's plan to change how the Israelites saw themselves was to change their names. They had Hebrew names, which gave glory to God. The meanings gave glory to God. And then Nebuchadnezzar changed their names so that their new names would declare glory to idols, his gods. So Daniel means God is my judge, and Belteshazzar means Bel, that idol, protects the king. Hananiah, his name meant God is gracious, and his new name, Shadrach, meant under the command of Aku, who's the moon god. Mishael meant there's none like God, and Meshach meant there's none like Aku, the moon god. Azariah meant God has helped me, and Abednego meant the servant of Nebo. the Babylonian god of wisdom. Let me ask you, have you ever been in an environment where it was difficult to be a faithful Christian? Anyway, just give me a show of hands. You ever been, even just for a day, anybody in an environment where it was hard to be a Christian? You know, there's some pressure. You've all skated through. It's been very easy. Let me give you some ones to jog your memory. Maybe you were maybe it was your school where it was hard to be a Christian. Maybe a sports team. You're on a sports team where it was difficult. Maybe your neighbors make it challenging. Maybe a college class, or a university campus, or a training course, or your first job, or when you applied for a specific program. Maybe your family makes it hard to be a Christian. How about a community organization that you've joined and found that it was difficult? Maybe your business connections, or maybe different levels of government. I think many of us have experienced some of the pressure of Babylon. Some of the pressure. I want to say, like when I was Daniel's age, well, maybe a little bit older, maybe when I was 16, not 15, the two areas where I experienced the most pressure on my faith were in the locker room for our high school football team, the Surrey Sabres. That locker room, I really felt like, for sure, I am the only Christian here. And the stuff that was happening in that locker room and the whole culture of the team, yeah, it was hard. At the same time, I got my first job around 16. And so now I was on the factory floor at Saputo Cheese Factory, making cheese. Girls used to say, "What do you do? How come you have so much money?" Because I had a factory job. Everybody else worked at McDonald's, but I was making twice as much because I was working in a factory. And how come you have so much money? And they liked that about me. I don't know what that is about women. Anyhow, how come you have so much money? And I say, well, I work at a cheese factory. Well, what do you do there? And my job actually was to use the wire cutters to take the 40-pound blocks and make them into smaller blocks. So I would say, I cut the cheese. It shocked me that I had so much money but could never get a girlfriend. I don't know what was going on. And maybe I wasn't playing it right, but first day on the job at the cheese factory. Now, I partly got the job because my dad encouraged me to apply there because my dad worked there. So on first day, I get there, I work the first 2 hours with this guy all by myself in this far off corner. I haven't met the rest of the guys. There's about 20 guys who work at this small cheese factory. We come back for coffee break. The room is 20 guys in the room. My dad is an out-and-out Christian. People will have known what he believed about many things. I don't think that made him popular with most guys at the cheese factory, but that was just the real deal. And so I'm in the coffee room, and John leans over. John has got the biggest biceps I've ever seen on a man up to that point in my life. This guy is huge, and he's the alpha dog on the factory floor. And he leans over to me and he says, "Hey, Steve, good to have you here. You got a girlfriend?" I am so intimidated. I'm the only teenager in the room. The next youngest guy is probably 10 years older than me. And I don't want to look like a loser, so I say, I pretty much stammer and go, yeah, I got a couple of possibilities. As you know from my previous statement, that was a lie. Something about cutting the cheese. Anyhow, so he turns it back on me and goes, "Oh, what did you say? A couple of prostitutes?" And I'm like, "No, I said a couple of possibilities." Like, I am nervous as all get out. And then he goes for the jugular. He says, "Well, when you do get a girlfriend," he said, "are you going to sleep with her before you get married?" This is first coffee break. I have no rapport with any of these guys, and my dad's sitting there. Ever seen a movie where it's like about surviving in prison? I wish I'd seen more of those by that point, because then I would have known, start a riot, hit the guy with a chair, and then they'll respect you later, or, something like that. So here's what I said, and it wasn't a satisfactory answer to John, and it wasn't a satisfactory answer to my dad, and now today it's not a satisfactory answer to me, but I just said, "None of your business." Like, I wanted to act tough. Now, I wish I could rewind the tape. Wish I could go back and be as comfortable enough in my own skin to say, "No, I'm not going to sleep with her before I get married because I'm a follower of Jesus." I would say that now. I'm comfortable with that now. In fact, that's what happened. But I felt I was under siege. I felt there was a pressure to not be a Christian, to not stand for what I believe in. And so I tried to find my way out of it, compromise the best I could. What does faithfulness in a high-pressure environment really look like? Verse 8. Let's read verse 8. It says, "But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way." So the royal food and wine would have included a lot of things forbidden by the Old Testament scriptures for the Israelites to eat. Now, there's a lot of debate among scholars on why Daniel chose the food and wine as his line not to cross. Like, he was going to be educated for 3 years in Babylonian stuff, which would have included magic arts, divination, all sorts of things that Israelites were not supposed to participate in. So why did he draw the line there? And then having his name changed to have a meaning that brings glory to the idols of Babylon. Why didn't he draw his line there? Why did he draw his line at the food? And some of the scholars have said that the food that they ate and drank and the food that they didn't eat and drink was probably one of the most defining things, because it was an everyday reality about God's people. It's an everyday reality. And so Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal wine and food. So Babylonians would have ate pork, which Jewish, good kosher Jews don't eat, and horse meat, which, well, it's not that popular anymore, is it? Israelites were not allowed to do those things. And they probably would have offered those things to idols first. So it's a very interesting comment I saw in one scholar. He said that these lavish meals would be made and then offered to the idol, and whatever was left over, the king's table would eat. And no king ever went hungry, because no idol ever ate any food. It's sort of implied. Anyhow, but it would be offered to the idols first, and that might have been another way that it could have been considered defiled food. But I think there might be some more to it. As much as giving up control of his diet might be sort of identifying, might be against his conscience and a compromise of his identity as a follower of the one true God, I think there's a faith test here. I mean, it's a food test, but it's a faith test. It's like, if we honor God, will he help us? I think it might have been a way to prove to themselves that God was still in control in their dark new circumstances. And that any advancement they got in this competitive environment where they were competing against the other young men who'd been pulled into the same program was not due to the greatness of Babylon or Nebuchadnezzar, but to God. And so they are testing. It's a test of faith. Will they conform to what the scriptures have said about what they eat and what they drink, or to the culture of Babylon? So Daniel asks that he and his friends be able to eat a different menu. Now, if you're a parent, you know how annoying this request is, right? You made supper, your kids sit down, they're like, I don't want to eat this stuff. That's why I just revert to Dad 101. I say, oh, I thought you were hungry. Not picky, something like that. Just some sort of, but it's just like, oh, it's annoying. I mean, I'm just trying to drum up a little bit of compassion for the official who has to deal with this demand, or not demand, but this request. It says, but now God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. Remember, before this we've heard that God caused the Israelites to be given over to Nebuchadnezzar because of their sin and disobedience. And now we see God actively entering the story again. And God is causing the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel and said, I am afraid of my lord the king who has assigned you food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. So it's not just Christians who are afraid of Babylon sometimes. Sometimes the fear is pretty palpable in other people's experience too. Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance, see if there's a difference, with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. I see lots of great things in here. And how to make a godly appeal in Babylon. How to make a godly, let me just give you some. One, choose the line you won't cross. Get clear about that. Like, what is the thing something you say, I don't have anything to do with all of this. Maybe that's not true, actually. Maybe there's just one particular aspect of what you're objecting to, and you get clear about that. That's helpful. So choose the line you won't cross, and then resolve not to compromise. Okay? So Daniel put up with the questionable education and the questionable name change, but he drew the line at being defiled by the royal food and wine. Okay? So he didn't just say, everything's wrong and I expect everything to change. He said, this is the line. This is how I can indicate that I am not Nebuchadnezzar's, but my main loyalty and allegiance is to God. And then pray. Now, we don't see him praying. It's not mentioned in here, but I bet it happened because he does pray in other situations. So I'm sure he prayed for favor and compassion from the one he'd be appealing to. That's a good thing to pray for. Pray for wisdom for yourself on how to approach them. You maybe think, this person's not going to give me a hearing. Pray for the right words and the strategy. God can give you strategies for a conversation. So pray for those things. Pray for understanding what their concerns are, right? So here's this guy. He is afraid that he will lose his head, that he'll be dead if these guys don't eat the royal food and drink. So pray that you'll understand that. You'll know what's holding that person up from granting the request that you're going to ask. And then ask for permission. In Canada, we're sort of used to be like, I got rights, I'm going to demand them. Well, you may have rights, and you may be able to demand them. But wouldn't it be great if you could find a way that it's not full-on head-to-head conflict? So ask. And then if they say no, consider a different way to make it easier for them to say yes, which is what Daniel did. He asked, and the guy said, no, I can't. I like you, Daniel. You're great. I have compassion for you, but I can't do this, or I'm going to die because you're going to not turn out looking as good as the other guys, and then Nebuchadnezzar is going to hold me to account. He says, well, just give us a 10-day test then. It was something he could agree to. And then, so if you come up with a solution that will work for you and them, then do the work required. This didn't mean that Daniel and the guys were going to go, hey, good, we got our request granted. Great, well, let's not study for any of the exams. Let's not study the literature. Let's slack off. No, do the work required that comes with it, and then trust God through it all. Trust God through it all. One of my favorite stories of making a godly appeal was a kid in my youth group when I was youth pastor in Nipawin. So it's going way, way back. Anyhow, he came to see me. His name was Keith. And Keith told me this. He said, he didn't live in Nipawin. He lived in Carrot River, but he came to my youth group in Nipawin. And Keith said, my teacher assigned me this book in class, and I read the first chapter and put it down. I do not think it's the kind of book that a Christian should be reading. And I think it was like just sexually explicit material or whatever in there. So anyhow, so he said, what do I do? And I said, there's a model in Scripture for making a godly appeal, Daniel. I said, this is what I'd advise you to do. I said, go to your teacher, think it through, how you're going to talk to her and and I said, you got to go respectfully. I said, and before you get to her to ask not to read this book, you need to pick out a book you will read, and it can't be like way easier than the book you were going to read. It's got to be at least as challenging as what she was giving you. And say that you will write a report on that book instead. But just explain why, as a Christian, you feel uneasy with this book and that you want to read this other book instead. But you make sure you have a plan in place so it's easy for her to say yes, and we'll see what happens, right? So anyhow, he goes away. I don't actually see him for a couple weeks, and actually a couple months. I don't really chat with him about this. And finally, we get back to it, and he says, "Hey, you know what? That worked." I said, "It worked?" He's like, "Yeah, that worked." And I didn't know if it would work. So I was like, "Oh, that's great. I'm so glad." He goes, "Yeah." So she suggests, you gave her another book and suggested that, and she took it. And I'm thinking he picked a classic like, Tom Sawyer or something. And so I'm like, "That's awesome." I'm saying, "That's great." I said, "What book did you pick?" "The book of Romans." I was like, "Wow, I wish I had thought of that." He studied the book of Romans, which makes even some Bible college students' faces turn pale when they have to study it because it's challenging. And he worked like crazy to write an incredible report on that book, and he got an A. Keith Boschman, by the way, now is the lead pastor of the Winnipeg E-Free Church. I looked at his website today. He's got a staff team of about 10. My claim to fame, just riding on someone else's coattails. But we're all sort of riding on God's coattails, aren't we, in this whole adventure? We're saying, I don't know what I'm doing, but I want to be faithful to God. And I believe if you come with that kind of heart towards God and ask him to give you the wisdom. Remember, that's part of shining in Babylon, is those who are wise will shine. The book has a lot to do with wisdom. And those who bring many into righteousness, that means into relationship with God, will shine. So it went well for Keith. How did it go for Daniel and his friends? Verse 15 says, at the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. At this point, if you're really a pro-vegetable, you might be like, yay, vegetables to the rescue. That is not the point of this chapter. These might have been the only things they could have eaten that weren't ritually defiled. For sure, they would have been things that would have been allowable under what the scriptures that they had would have said that they could eat. And so maybe it really was the only option. It wasn't like, hey, this is the better diet. Quit eating meat. That's not the message today. But the food test was a faith test. And they were testing, if we honor God in this area, will God help us? And they looked healthier than the rest. But that's not all. It says, to these 4 young men, God gave, here's God intervening in the story very explicitly, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. God helped them to excel in their learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. So God blessed them. And I think that's a principle that, look at this. Like, when you commit to doing things God's way, God often glorifies himself by honoring you. Now, this isn't a magic formula. I mean, sometimes when you honor God, you end up suffering. Right? You can't take away all the persecution and the martyrdom that's happened in the Christian church throughout the centuries and just say, it always works out on happy outcome here on earth. But it is a principle that when you honor God, he will honor you. That honor may be experienced here, and for many people, they've experienced that. It may be in the life to come. But the things we do in obedience to God, he will honor. So here's a principle that I think is important if you want to stand out in Babylon, if you want to shine. You can't really make a difference unless you are different. Now, I'm not talking about being weird. There's lots of things that are weird. You look at Christian bumper stickers? They say things like, in case of rapture, this car will be unmanned. It's like, is that the right starting place for sharing the gospel? end-time apocalyptic event and vehicular damage. I don't know if that's where you want to start. How about this one? Do you follow Jesus this closely? It's not just bumper stickers. You just go on the internet, you find memes or little slogans, stuff you can paste on your wall, print that, right? God answers knee mail. Ooh, it's like a dad joke and a spiritual moment. Anyhow, tweet others how you would want to be tweeted. Adam and Eve were the first ones not to read the Apple terms and conditions. Honk if you love Jesus, text if you want to meet him. Someone is tweeting one of these right now. Stop it. Lord willing, there'll be better stuff in this sermon than that. Well, I'm glad that God is still gracious to us weird Christians. But we're not trying to be weird, are we? We're trying to be distinct from Babylon in very specific, crucial ways. For these Hebrew teenagers, the first application was faithfulness to God in what they ate and drank. And they would be guided by the Bible and not Babylon in that decision. Now, as New Testament Christians, we're not under Torah law, right? So if you eat pork for lunch today, you're not under any condemnation for that. So what does it look like for us today? How do we keep from defiling ourselves with the royal food and wine in our Babylon? Well, we're going to look at a few different things throughout the next few weeks. We'll look at some of the things that are very specific to our generation, right? We'll look at things like individualism, consumerism. We'll look at, relativism, other things like that. But I want to talk about just like an ancient big three areas, okay? And I think it was St. Augustine who said that followers of Jesus are most distinguishable from the world or from Babylon in their attitudes towards these big three things, okay? Money, sex, and power. Let's go. Money. So Babylon approaches money from the standpoint of acquisition. Get all you can, keep all you can, maybe give a little bit away to show you're a good person, maintain your standing in the community. But money is your lifeblood, the key to a good life. But for the believer, because God is their trust and God is their treasure, they have a totally different attitude towards money. Yes, we use money to live, but we also recognize that money is something entrusted to us for the advancement of God's kingdom. So as God prospers us, we're not just thinking about how to advance our standard of living, we're also thinking about how to advance our standard of giving, to grow in the grace of generosity, as it says in the New Testament. So, I was looking at this week of just different slogans. I like this one. Do you live sufficiently and give extravagantly? Or do you give sufficiently and live extravagantly? You see the difference there? Is your life about giving? I mean, God so loved the world, including you and including me, that he gave his only son. I mean, the greatest generosity you could ever experience in life is to receive God's gift of salvation that he has for us. The way that, thank you. Can I get a witness? I just got one. It's true. That's the greatest generosity you can ever experience in your life. That's why I keep saying to you, time after time, I always say, you've been made, if you trusted in what Christ has done for you, and you've come to trust in what he's done on the cross for you, to take your sins upon himself so that you can, in exchange, have the righteousness of God accredited to your account, you've been made rich and can never be made poor. So that helps you around money. It helps you. Now the world and Babylon is constantly bombarding us with money's your life. Money's your measurement. Money's your trust. Money's your security. We're always focused on, or that's always being pushed in front of us. I remember how breathtaking it was. I was like probably about 20, and I was out tree planting in western, northern Alberta and northern BC with my cousin Alan. And one night, late at night, he told me what his goal was in life regarding money. He said, my goal is to be very frugal, but incredibly generous. And I remember thinking, I have never heard of anything quite like that before. And then I read the scriptures and I'm like, oh yeah, this is here. That's where it comes from. I mean, my cousin Alan is a strong believer. He said, I'm gonna be frugal. I'm not gonna spend a ton of money on me, but I'm gonna give a ton of money in my life. I remember just thinking, now that's a vision for money. I loved when he shared that with me. Let's talk about sex. Babylon approaches sex from the standpoint, it's all about me, and if it feels good, it can't be wrong. The believer sees sex as a gift from God to be used for God's purposes, according to God's design. So within a covenant-based, lifelong marriage between a man and a woman. Now, I've talked about money and sex. The distinction, the difference between Babylon, it was often said about the Romans, where, again, the Roman Empire was the empire of the day when Jesus' life and his disciples lived. But there was a very distinct difference between the Romans and the Christians in these two categories. It was said of the early Christians they stood in stark contrast to the Roman citizens because the Christians were promiscuous with their money. Promiscuous means freely dispersing or generous. They were promiscuous with their money and guarded with their beds. While the Romans were guarded or stingy with their money and promiscuous with their beds. So I get it. Like, Christians in the culture sometimes seem totally backwards by Babylonian standards, or by Canadian standards, or by cheese factory standards. Because we don't just gorge on the royal food and wine, but we actually recognize that God has designed this to work in a certain way, and we're going to honor him, we're going to trust him. That if we do things his way, that's the way that people are meant to flourish. That's the way that society flourishes. That's the way that families flourish. That's the way that individuals will flourish. How about power, the third one of the big three, the ancient big three, I'll call them. For Babylon, whatever power you have, you press it to your advantage. It might be your looks, then use it. If it's your money, use that. If it's your talent or your majority culture status, you might even find a way to use your minority culture status. Whatever you got, use it to your advantage. Whatever power you have is to be held on to and pressed for advantage. But the Christian sees any position of power or privilege just like Jesus did. Something which to serve and lift others up. So the follower of Jesus always asks, how can I use this position of power or privilege to lift up others around me? In that way, we're distinct from Babylon. So what about you? Do you stand out? Do you look strange? Are you distinctly different in these areas? Why don't you just imagine that you're watching a football game and it's halftime, the marching band comes on, and everybody's marching in lockstep together to the beat of the one drum. And they're all marching inside. And then there's this one guy, and you're like, he is totally out of step. In fact, you don't know what steps he's doing because it has nothing to do with, he's dressed the same as the others. He's there, obviously a part of the marching band, but he is not marching in step with everyone else. In fact, he's got his own crazy dance moves that he is doing. And then that's when you look closely and you realize he's got his AirPods in. And he's dancing to Drake. And he's drawing from a whole different source. And that's why his dance moves are out of step and look strange and different from the others. Because he's dialed into music from another place. The question is, what are you dialed into? All right, if you're marching according to heaven's values, you might look strange. You will look strange. There'll be some places where it'll show up. For those of you who are college students, or you're maybe young professionals just starting out in career, you might approach your career by saying, which career will make me feel the most fulfilled or get me the most money? And they're not terrible questions, but they are the only and pretty much main questions that Babylon asks. If you're shaped by the Bible, I think you're going to ask another question, and that is, which career will help me to best serve the Great Commission? I remember I was talking to, in my youth group here at Nipawin, I was talking to a young lady, and she was graduating, and I was trying to give her some career advice, and she was talking about different things, and she said, I really want to go, out to certain nations and care for orphans and different things, and I just was like, I love that, that's awesome. And anyhow, we got talking more and more, and then between myself and then the current principal of her school, who was also helping her, we said, you know what, I think you do great in nursing, and nursing will open doors for you to go and take the gospel to the nations that you want to go to. So again, I can tell you, that's super rare. That a conversation about career overlaps with a conversation about taking the Great Commission somewhere. But it should be more normal. It should be a question we're asking. I mean, you've got to have a job, but where and how you have that job is something to figure out. The call of Jesus for you to leverage your life for the Great Commission is not some special call that only a few get. It's for all believers. And so if you're at a decision point, a significant decision point like choosing a career, well, think about, how can I use that career? Where can I use that career to further the Great Commission? It should be part of the process. Now, maybe you're older and you're about to retire, or you're maybe about, I have some friends who, they did the, sort of career path that allows them to have Freedom 55. I have a different plan. I'll tell you about it in a moment. But if you're encountering, you're getting to that age, like right around my age, and you're thinking, I wonder what the second act will be for me. Maybe you're going into a second career. Or maybe you're older than that and you're just retiring and you're wondering about retirement. It can easily get down to, well, now I've got enough money, or now I can just get up and do what I want all day with no obligations. But I think you should include in your decision making, how can I use this chapter so I can contribute the most to invest in His kingdom. So I said I'm approaching 55, but Freedom 55 is not mine. I'm aiming for Freedom 13.5. How many of you have heard of Freedom 13.5? I was just wondering if someone put their hand up for fun, because I just made it up. Here's Hebrews 13.5. I made it up yesterday. Hebrews 13.5 is where Freedom 55 comes from. Keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have, because God has said, never will I leave you, never will I forsake you. You want a retirement verse? Whether you got a little bit of money or no money for retirement, this verse, even if you have a lot of money, this verse is pertinent. This is my hope and my dream and my plan. I hope to keep my life free from the love of money. I know there's been seasons in my life where my fear about money or my fascination with money has gotten out of hand. What I want for the sprint to the finish is to be free from the love of money. I want to be content with what I have. And I want to center my contentment in the promise of God that He will never leave me nor forsake me. That's the best retirement plan. That's the best retirement promise. Freedom 13.5. Sign up today. Actually, if you're looking at retirement and you just even want to come back to some of these principles, read Hebrews 13, 1-8. I won't read it here today, but it is full of reinforcement of what I've been sharing with you already today. So God has called us to be different, not to conform to the culture, but to conform to Scripture. So in the weeks to come, we'll talk about the royal food that the culture is asking us to eat and drink. I'm going to just end with one story here today where I think someone showed me a way to not conform to the culture. I think one of the measurements that, or one of the distinctions that you can have in your life about whether you're conforming to the culture is, am I running towards suffering or running away from it? See, the people of Babylon used their power and money to take them away from suffering, to isolate themselves from it, and to bring them as much comfort as possible. But for the follower of Jesus, it's the opposite. The trajectory of our lives calls us towards suffering. Because Jesus moved towards suffering. So the more money and power you have, the more you're freed up to bless others. If I'm in a place to be able to give, then I'm able to move towards those who are suffering. So the Canadian dream, the Babylonian dream will take you one location, but the gospel mission will take you in a completely other place. The last season, I had the privilege of officiating at my friend Rob Stanowski's funeral. And Rob was a very unique guy. And I think some of the things that, everyone's got a unique personality, but for me, the thing about Rob is, it struck me as his faith in who God was. And so I remember Rob was battling with cancer, and he was at sort of a church meeting we had here, and it was a meeting about reaching others for Christ. So it was like he only had a very little bit amount of time left, and yet he was still yearning and pressing forward. He and Angela, his wife, were pressing forward to see what God could do in their day. He wanted to see people in Saskatchewan come to know Jesus. And I remember we went around the room, and everybody shared a little bit about where they were at spiritually, and he just said, I'm in the fight of my life with cancer, but I still serve a big God. That big God thinking affected how Rob lived his life. Rob and Angela had the privilege a couple times, or a few times, to go to Hawaii on vacation. But Rob never did a Hawaii vacation like anyone else. Because he'd go to Waikiki, and he'd make it his goal to learn the names of every homeless people on the strip there. And he'd get to know them all. I'm Rob from Canada. How are you doing today? Can I buy you coffee? And you just press into their lives and find out where life hurts and how they were suffering. And you say, well, I want to tell you, I serve a big God. Can I pray for you? I've never seen it on a brochure for going to Hawaii, that you can do this tour, Rob's tour down the strip. But he got to know them so well that when he would come again, he'd go look for them by name. Where's Nancy? Where's Todd? Where's Bill at? And they say, oh, Rob from Canada's back. One time he went, and he was asking about a certain guy. He was a guy who had actually been a shipbuilder in some of the better times of his life, but he had an accident, and his legs were both damaged, and he ended up in a wheelchair. And so he was homeless on the strip. And so he came, and he said, where's this guy? Where's this guy? I haven't found him yet. And they said, oh, he had to be taken to a hospital somewhere. And nobody really knew where he was. So Rob got on the phone, and he just started phoning all the different hospitals in Hawaii and saying, do you got this guy? Do you got this guy? Do you got this guy? And he found him. And he went to the hospital and walked into his room. He said, hey, I've been looking for you. If God frees you up, if your trust in God becomes such a dynamic in your life that you just go, man, I can trust God about my future. I can trust God about my circumstances. God will free you up. You'll move towards suffering with the confidence that a big God is backing you up. And you'll be able to stand in Babylon. By the grace of God, you'll be able to stand. You'll be able to make those maybe costly decisions I'm not saying they'll be easy and that everything will work out with a happy face on the end. I'm saying costly decisions to stand with Christ instead of to bow and deny him. And that's my prayer for you, that God would free you from the love of money, free you from anything else that might bind you or hold you back, and release you into the future that he's got for you. Would you stand with me? Lord, I pray for anyone who, even as we've been talking about this today, they feel like they are under siege. Maybe there's dynamics or relationships where it just seems like it's so hard to be a Christian in these moments. Whatever the circumstances are, Lord, I pray that you would just remind them again that you will not leave them and you will not forsake them. You are with us in trouble. You go with us into the dark valleys and in the darkest corners of our lives and in the most distressing circumstances. You will not abandon us. And Lord, you give us what we need. You'll give us what you need to honor you. And Lord, whether our honoring leads to being exalted in this life or it leads to honor from you in the next life, Lord, we'll leave that up to you. But Lord, we want to honor you. We want to shine. We want to show the world that your kingdom is different than the kingdom of the world. We want to follow the footsteps of Jesus who came and upheld all the truth of the commands of Scripture, and yet at the time he drew some of those who felt so distant from God close to you because he was different. We want to be different like Jesus. That's our prayer. So Lord, free us from those trappings of the world. Free us from the temptations of money, sex, and power, and whatever else could be named. Help us to keep our lives free of those things so that we can live the life that you've called us to. In your name we pray. Amen.